The sealed envelope in my hands felt heavier than it should have as I sat in Harold Whitman's mahogany-lined office, watching my mother's face transform from smug satisfaction to confusion. She had no idea that inside this envelope lay not just my grandfather's will, but 3 years of carefully documented evidence that would change everything. The irony wasn't lost on me. She thought she was about to inherit a fortune, but she had no clue she'd been systematically writing herself out of it for months. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Well, open it already, Patricia snapped, her manicured fingers drumming impatiently against the leather armchair. Beside her, Derek leaned forward with barely contained excitement, his eyes fixed on the envelope like a predator watching prey. They made quite the pair, my 54-year-old mother and her 42-year-old boyfriend, both dressed as if they were already spending money that wasn't theirs. Mr. Whitman adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and cleared his throat. Perhaps we should review the circumstances one more time before we proceed. His voice carried the measured tone of someone who had delivered both good and devastating news countless times throughout his 40-year career. I nodded slowly, keeping my expression neutral despite the storm of emotions churning inside me. I think that would be wise. My name is Zara Nakamura, and I'm 32 years old. 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who my mother was and where I stood in our family. Today, sitting in this law office in downtown Portland, I'm about to discover just how wrong a person can be about the people closest to them. This is the story of how I learned that sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from those who should love us unconditionally, and how careful preparation can turn the tables in ways no one expects. The Nakamura family vineyard stretched across 200 acres of prime Willamette Valley real estate, a legacy that began when my great-grandfather immigrated from Japan in 1952. He planted the first vines with nothing but determination and a dream of creating something lasting for future generations. My grandfather, Vincent Nakamura, inherited that dream and transformed it into something extraordinary. By the time I was old enough to understand what we had, Nakamura Vineyards was producing award-winning Pinot Noir that commanded premium prices at restaurants across the Pacific Northwest. Growing up, I spent every summer at the vineyard. While other kids attended camps or lounged by pools, I learned about soil composition, harvest timing, and the delicate art of fermentation. Grandpa Vincent would walk me through the rows of vines, his weathered hands gentle as he showed me how to identify disease, when to prune, and why certain slopes produced better grapes than others. Those walks weren't just about viticulture, they were about legacy, responsibility, and understanding that some things were worth preserving for future generations. My mother Patricia had a different relationship with the vineyard. She saw it as her escape from what she considered a boring small-town existence. The moment she graduated high school, she moved to Seattle, chasing dreams of urban sophistication and distancing herself from what she called dirt under fingernails work. She visited sporadically, usually when she needed money or wanted to impress whatever man she was dating at the time. The irony was that while Patricia was rejecting her heritage, I was embracing it. Not in the traditional sense. I had no desire to become a vintner, but I understood the deeper value of what my grandfather had built. During college, I studied business and photography, eventually establishing Nakamura Studios, a commercial photography business specializing in food and beverage marketing. Many of my clients were wineries, and my intimate knowledge of the industry gave me an edge that competitors couldn't match. What started as a natural extension of my family background evolved into something more significant. I began documenting the vineyard's seasonal cycles, creating a visual archive that captured not just the beauty of the landscape but the intricate process of winemaking. These photographs became part of the vineyard's marketing materials, helping elevate the brand's prestige and directly contributing to increased sales. More importantly, I was present. When Grandpa Vincent needed someone to drive him to medical appointments as his arthritis worsened, I rearranged my schedule. When harvest season required extra hands, I was there with my camera, documenting the process while also helping coordinate logistics. When he wanted to update the vineyard's website and social media presence, I donated hundreds of hours creating content that showcased our wines in their best light. Patricia, meanwhile, remained absent. Her visits became even less frequent after she started dating Derek Hayes 3 years ago. Derek was everything my grandfather wasn't: flashy, loud, and perpetually scheming about get-rich-quick investments that never seemed to materialize. He worked in real estate development, though his success in that field appeared questionable, given his tendency to borrow money from Patricia whenever his big deals fell through. The first sign of trouble came 18 months ago during one of Patricia's rare visits to the vineyard. I had stopped by to check on Grandpa Vincent and found them in his study, hunched over financial documents spread across his antique desk. The conversation stopped abruptly when I entered, and I noticed Patricia quickly gathering papers while Derek smiled with the kind of forced cheerfulness that immediately put me on guard. "Just helping Dad review his estate planning," Patricia explained, though her tone carried a defensive edge that suggested there was more to the story. "At his age, it's important to have everything organized." Grandpa Vincent looked uncomfortable, his usual warmth replaced by a tense silence that spoke volumes. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He seemed distracted during our usual walks through the vineyard, and conversations about the future of the business became stilted and brief. When I asked directly if something was bothering him, he would deflect with questions about my work or comments about the weather. The second red flag appeared 6 months later. Patricia began visiting more frequently, but these weren't the casual family visits of years past. She arrived with Derek in tow, and their conversations with Grandpa Vincent always took place behind closed doors. When I encountered them, the discussions would immediately shift to mundane topics like local weather patterns or recent harvest yields. During one of these visits, I overheard Derek on his phone in the vineyard's tasting room, speaking in the hushed tones people use when discussing confidential matters. His words were fragmented, but certain phrases caught my attention. Prime development potential, subdivision possibilities, and once the old man transfers everything. The implications were clear enough to make my stomach clench with dread. That evening, I tried talking to Grandpa Vincent about what I'd overheard, but he became agitated in a way I'd never seen before. His hands shook as he insisted that Derek was simply exploring options and that I shouldn't worry about matters that didn't concern me. The conversation ended with him retreating to his bedroom earlier than usual, leaving me alone with a growing sense that something fundamental was shifting in our family dynamic. The third and most alarming incident occurred just 2 months ago. I arrived at the vineyard unannounced, intending to surprise Grandpa Vincent with prints of the photographs I'd taken during the previous harvest. Instead, I found Patricia and Derek in the vineyard's business office, going through filing cabinets with the methodical thoroughness of people conducting an inventory. When they noticed me in the doorway, their reaction was immediate and telling. Patricia's face flushed red while Derek slammed shut the drawer he'd been examining. For several seconds, none of us spoke, and the silence stretched uncomfortably as I processed what I was witnessing. "We're just organizing Dad's paperwork," Patricia finally said, but her explanation lacked conviction. "Some of these files haven't been touched in years. Everything's scattered and disorganized." Derek nodded enthusiastically, too enthusiastically. "Your grandfather asked us to help get his affairs in order. You know how overwhelming this kind of administrative work can be for someone his age." I looked around the office, noting that documents were indeed scattered, but not in the way files become disorganized through neglect. Instead, everything appeared to have been deliberately sorted into separate piles, as if someone was categorizing information according to specific criteria. Bank statements occupied one corner of the desk, legal documents another, and property assessments were stacked near the computer. "Where is Grandpa Vincent?" I asked, fighting to keep my voice level. "Napping," Patricia replied quickly. "He's been tired lately. All this paperwork has been stressing him out, so we told him to rest while we handled the sorting." Something about her explanation felt wrong, but I couldn't immediately identify what. Grandpa Vincent had always been meticulous about his record-keeping, and the idea that his files were disorganized enough to require outside intervention seemed unlikely. Moreover, he had never mentioned feeling overwhelmed by administrative tasks, and I spoke with him at least twice a week. I excused myself and went to check on him, finding him not napping but sitting on the back porch, staring out at the vineyards with an expression of deep melancholy. When he saw me approaching, he attempted a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey kiddo," he said, using the nickname that had followed me into adulthood. "I didn't expect to see you today." I settled into the chair beside him, studying his profile, as he gazed across the rows of vines that represented 3 generations of family labor. He turned toward me then, and I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a combination of sadness, resignation, and what might have been fear. "I've made some mistakes, Zara," he said quietly, "decisions I'm not sure how to undo." Before I could respond, Derek's voice called out from inside the house. "Vincent, we need you to sign these documents while the notary is here." My grandfather's shoulders sagged as he stood, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked every one of his 78 years. "I should go handle this," he murmured, but he paused at the porch door and looked back at me. "Promise me something, kiddo. No matter what happens, remember that this place," he gestured toward the vineyard, "was built with love. That's what matters most." At the time, I didn't fully understand the weight of his words, or the reason behind his suddenly fragile appearance. I assumed he was simply feeling overwhelmed by whatever administrative tasks Patricia and Derek were helping him complete. Looking back now, I realize he was trying to warn me about what was coming, though the constraints of whatever situation he'd found himself in prevented him from being more direct. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Patricia and Derek's visits became more frequent, and always involved closed-door meetings with my grandfather. His demeanor grew increasingly subdued, and our conversations became stilted and brief. When I tried to discuss the vineyard's future, or my ongoing photography projects documenting the property, he would change the subject or excuse himself entirely. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago, when I received a phone call that changed everything. Harold Whitman, the family's longtime attorney, called my studio on a Wednesday afternoon, with news that hit me like a physical blow. "Zara, I'm calling to inform you that your grandfather passed away peacefully in his sleep last night."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He said, his professional composure barely containing what sounded like genuine grief. "I know this comes as a shock, and I'm deeply sorry for your loss." The phone slipped from my hand, clattering against my desk as the reality of his words sank in. Grandpa Vincent was gone, and I hadn't even known he was seriously ill. The last time we'd spoken, just 2 days earlier, he'd seemed tired, but not critically unwell. How had I missed something so significant? Mr. Whitman continued speaking, though I had to ask him to repeat most of what he'd said. "The funeral arrangements are being handled by your mother. She's asked me to schedule a reading of the will for early next week. Can you be available Monday morning at 10? I agreed, though I could barely focus on the practical details. The loss felt surreal, compounded by guilt that I hadn't been present during his final days. Later, when I called Patricia to discuss funeral arrangements and express my condolences, her response struck me as oddly detached. "It was his time," she said matter-of-factly. "He'd been declining for weeks. Derek and I were with him constantly toward the end, handling all the arrangements he'd requested." Something in her tone bothered me, though grief made it difficult to analyze my instincts objectively. She seemed more focused on logistical matters than emotional processing, discussing funeral home selections and catering options with the efficiency of someone planning a business meeting, rather than mourning a beloved parent. The funeral itself was a small affair, attended primarily by vineyard employees, a few longtime customers, and several local winemakers who had considered my grandfather a mentor. Patricia and Derek sat in the front row, accepting condolences with what appeared to be appropriate solemnity, though I noticed Derek checking his phone repeatedly during the service. What struck me most was how many people approached me specifically to share memories of my grandfather's pride in my photography work and my involvement with the vineyard. "He talked about you constantly," said Maria Gonzalez, the vineyard's head of operations. "Always showing off your pictures and bragging about how you understood the business better than anyone." These conversations painted a picture of a man who had viewed me not just as a beloved granddaughter, but as the natural successor to the family legacy. This perspective stood in stark contrast to Patricia's version of events, which consistently portrayed me as a peripheral figure in my grandfather's life and business concerns. The discrepancy became even more pronounced during the week between the funeral and the will reading. Patricia and Derek moved into the vineyard house temporarily, ostensibly to handle estate matters and prepare the property for whatever transitions lay ahead. When I offered to help with these preparations, Patricia declined with unusual firmness. "Everything's under control," she assured me. "Derek has experience with estate transitions, and we don't want to burden you with administrative details while you're grieving." Her dismissal felt patronizing, especially given my intimate knowledge of the vineyard's operations and my grandfather's business practices. I had been involved in various aspects of the vineyard's management for years, from marketing and photography to harvest logistics and customer relations. The idea that I would be considered a burden during the estate transition seemed both insulting and suspicious. My concerns deepened when I attempted to access the vineyard's business office and found that the locks had been changed. When I mentioned this to Patricia, she explained that Derek had recommended enhanced security measures to protect valuable documents during the estate settlement process. The explanation was plausible, but it effectively prevented me from reviewing any records or understanding the true scope of my grandfather's final financial situation. These accumulated incidents created a growing sense of unease that I couldn't shake. Something about the entire situation felt orchestrated, as if Patricia and Derek were controlling information and access in ways that served their interests, rather than honoring my grandfather's wishes or protecting the family legacy. That unease transformed into active suspicion during a conversation I had with Maria Gonzalez 2 days before the will reading. She had worked for my grandfather for 15 years and knew the vineyard's operations better than anyone except him. When I mentioned my concerns about the estate transition, her response was both illuminating and alarming. "Your grandfather was worried about something these last few months," she confided. "He kept asking me about property valuations and market conditions for vineyard sales. He also had me prepare detailed financial reports that he'd never requested before." She went on to explain that my grandfather had seemed particularly concerned about ensuring that certain documentation was properly secured. In the weeks before his death, he had asked her to make copies of various business records and financial statements, instructing her to keep them in a separate location from the main office files. "He told me it was for backup purposes," Maria said, "but something about the way he said it made me think there was more to it. Like he was worried someone might try to access or alter the original documents." This revelation crystallized my growing suspicions into something approaching certainty. My grandfather hadn't just been concerned about general estate planning, he had been taking specific steps to protect important information from potential tampering or misappropriation. The question was whether his precautions had been sufficient to prevent whatever he'd been worried about. As Monday morning approached, I found myself caught between grief over my grandfather's death and anxiety about what the will reading might reveal. Patricia's behavior over the past few months, Derek's suspicious involvement in family matters, and the various security measures my grandfather had apparently felt necessary, all pointed toward a situation far more complex than a simple estate transition. The night before the will reading, I sat in my apartment reviewing everything I knew about the family's financial situation and the vineyard's value. Conservative estimates put the property's worth at somewhere between $8 and $12 million, depending on development potential and market conditions. The business itself generated substantial annual profits, and my grandfather had always been careful about investments and savings. In a conventional inheritance scenario, as his only child, Patricia would likely inherit the majority of the estate, with perhaps a smaller bequest designated for me as his only grandchild. This outcome would be legally straightforward and emotionally acceptable, even if it meant the end of my direct involvement with the vineyard. But nothing about recent events had followed conventional patterns, and I had a growing suspicion that tomorrow's will reading would contain surprises that none of us were fully prepared for. As I finally fell asleep, that Sunday night, my last conscious thought was wondering whether my grandfather's final act would protect his legacy, or whether Patricia and Derek's months of maneuvering had successfully positioned them to inherit everything he had spent a lifetime building. The answer waited in Harold Whitman's office, sealed in an envelope that would either validate my worst fears, or prove that my grandfather had been one step ahead of those who underestimated his wisdom and foresight. Monday morning arrived with the kind of gray Portland drizzle that made everything feel subdued and uncertain. I dressed carefully in my best black suit, the same one I'd worn to Grandpa Vincent's funeral just over a week ago. As I drove through the familiar streets toward downtown, my mind kept circling back to Maria's words about the backup documents and my grandfather's apparent concerns during his final months. Harold Whitman's law office occupied the entire 15th floor of a glass tower that overlooked the Willamette River. I'd been there twice before, both times with my grandfather for routine legal matters. The space exuded old money respectability, with dark wood paneling, Persian rugs, and walls lined with leather-bound legal volumes that probably hadn't been opened in decades. Everything about the environment was designed to convey stability, tradition, and trustworthiness. Patricia and Derek were already seated in the main conference room when I arrived, positioned at one end of the massive mahogany table, as if they were hosting the meeting rather than attending it. Patricia wore a navy blue dress that I'd never seen before, complemented by pearls that looked expensive enough to represent a significant investment. Derek had opted for a charcoal gray suit that appeared tailored, a notable upgrade from his usual business casual attire. Their appearance suggested they'd spent considerable money preparing for this occasion, which struck me as odd, given that they supposedly didn't know what to expect from the will reading. Most people attending such events dressed respectfully, but not ostentatiously. Patricia and Derek looked like they were attending a celebration rather than a somber legal proceeding. "Good morning, Zara," Patricia said, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been present during our recent conversations. "You look lovely. I'm sure Dad would be pleased to see us all here together, handling his affairs with dignity." Derek nodded enthusiastically. "Your grandfather was lucky to have such a devoted family. It's exactly what he would have wanted, everyone coming together during this difficult time." Their sudden cordiality felt forced and theatrical, as if they were performing roles for an audience I couldn't see. During the past few months, our interactions had been strained at best, marked by short responses and clear attempts to limit my involvement in family matters. This abrupt shift to warm familiarity seemed calculated rather than genuine. Mr. Whitman entered the conference room, carrying a thick manila folder, and wearing the expression of someone who had spent considerable time preparing for a complex presentation. He was a tall, thin man in his early 70s, with silver hair, and the kind of measured demeanor that came from decades of delivering both welcome and unwelcome news to families in crisis. "Thank you all for being here," he began, settling into his chair at the head of the table. "Before we proceed with the formal reading, I want to review some background information that will help you understand the context of Vincent's final wishes." He opened the folder and removed several documents, arranging them in neat piles across the table's surface. I noticed that some of the papers appeared to be recent additions, with bright white sheets contrasting against the aged appearance of older documents. Vincent first established his will 15 years ago, shortly after his wife's passing, Mr. Whitman continued. He updated it twice in the intervening years, most recently 6 months ago. The final version reflects his most current intentions regarding the distribution of his estate. 6 months ago. The timing aligned perfectly with when Patricia and Derek's visits had become more frequent and my grandfather's behavior had grown increasingly withdrawn. I felt a chill of apprehension as I realized that whatever changes had been made to the will had occurred during the period when I'd been systematically excluded from family discussions. Patricia leaned forward with obvious interest. "What kind of changes did he make? I hope he didn't complicate things unnecessarily. Dad always had a tendency to overthink simple situations." Mr. Whitman's expression remained neutral, but I caught a flicker of something disapproval perhaps in his eyes. The changes were quite specific and reflected Vincent's evolving understanding of family dynamics and business considerations. He spent considerable time discussing his intentions with me during our final meetings. Derek shifted in his chair, his eagerness barely contained. "I'm sure whatever he decided was fair to everyone involved." Vincent struck me as someone who understood the importance of family unity and practical estate management. The attorney's pause lasted just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Vincent was indeed concerned with family unity, though his perspective on what that meant may differ from your expectations. He reached for the top document in the pile, holding it in a way that prevented us from seeing its contents. "Before I read the formal will, I need to address some irregularities that came to light during the estate settlement process." My stomach dropped. Irregularities suggested problems, complications that none of us had anticipated. Patricia's confident expression faltered slightly, while Derek's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Whitman removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, a gesture that seemed designed to give him time to choose his words carefully. 3 weeks ago, the day after Vincent's passing, I received a call from Patricia requesting immediate access to estate documents and financial records. She indicated that she needed to begin probate proceedings as quickly as possible to prevent any complications with the vineyard's operations. I looked at Patricia, who maintained her composure but couldn't quite hide a flash of irritation at having her actions described so clinically. "That seems reasonable," she said. "The vineyard can't just sit idle while legal procedures drag on for months. There are employees to pay, contracts to fulfill, and seasonal obligations that can't wait for bureaucratic processes." Mr. Whitman nodded. "Absolutely correct, which is why I was prepared to expedite the necessary paperwork. However, when I reviewed Vincent's file to begin that process, I discovered that several important documents were missing." The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the building's ventilation system. Derek's hand moved to Patricia's shoulder in what appeared to be a supportive gesture, but I noticed his fingers gripping slightly, as if he was trying to steady himself rather than comfort her. "Missing how?" Derek asked, his voice carefully controlled. Gone from the locked filing cabinet where they should have been stored. Mr. Whitman replied. Documents that Vincent and I had reviewed together just 2 months ago were simply no longer present. Original property deeds, financial statements, and most significantly, a codicil to the will that Vincent had signed during our last meeting. The word codicil hung in the air like a challenge. Even I knew enough about legal terminology to understand that a codicil represented a modification or addition to an existing will. If my grandfather had made last-minute changes to his estate plans, those changes could fundamentally alter whatever expectations any of us had about the inheritance. Patricia's composure cracked slightly. I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation. Dad was getting forgetful toward the end. Maybe he moved them somewhere else for safekeeping. That was my initial assumption as well, Mr. Whitman said. However, Vincent had been very specific about document security during our recent meetings. He was concerned about unauthorized access to his personal papers and had implemented several safeguards to prevent such problems. He reached into the folder and withdrew a set of keys. These are duplicates of the keys to Vincent's filing cabinets, desk, and safe. He gave them to me during our last meeting, along with instructions that they should only be used in the event of his death and only in the presence of all beneficiaries. Derek's face had gone pale, and I could see perspiration forming along his hairline despite the cool temperature in the office. So you're saying someone broke into his office and stole legal documents? That's a serious criminal allegation. I'm not making any allegations, Mr. Whitman replied calmly. I'm simply describing the facts as I discovered them. However, I can tell you that there was no evidence of forced entry. Whoever accessed those documents had legitimate keys or knew where to find them. The implication was clear, though unstated. Someone with authorized access to my grandfather's office had removed important documents, presumably to prevent them from being discovered during the estate settlement process. The timing of Patricia and Derek's increased involvement in my grandfather's affairs made them the obvious suspects, though Mr. Whitman was too professional to make direct accusations. Fortunately, he continued, Vincent's concerns about document security led him to take additional precautions. He provided me with copies of all critical papers, including the codicil with specific instructions about their use. Relief flooded through me so suddenly that I felt dizzy. My grandfather's paranoia about document protection hadn't been the rambling concern of an aging man. It had been a calculated response to legitimate threats to his estate plans. Patricia's mask of composed grief finally slipped completely. What exactly are you suggesting? That Derek and I somehow conspired to steal legal documents? That's absolutely ridiculous. We were trying to help Dad organize his affairs because he was overwhelmed and confused. I'm not suggesting anything, Mr. Whitman repeated. I'm simply providing context for what you're about to hear. Vincent was very clear about his intentions, and the documentation I have in my possession reflects his final legally binding wishes. He opened the formal will and began reading in the measured cadence that lawyers use for such occasions. The preliminary sections were standard legal language, establishing my grandfather's identity, mental competency, and the revocation of all previous wills. Nothing in these opening paragraphs suggested anything unusual or controversial. The first specific bequest was a modest surprise. To Maria Gonzalez, who has served faithfully as vineyard manager for 15 years, I leave the sum of $200,000 and a lifetime right to occupy the manager's cottage on the vineyard property, in recognition of her loyalty and dedication to preserving the family business. I smiled despite the tension in the room. Maria had been like family to my grandfather, and her expertise was largely responsible for the vineyard's continued success. The bequest was generous without being extravagant, exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that characterized my grandfather's approach to relationships. Patricia shifted impatiently. That's lovely, but can we move on to the primary inheritance? Some of us have obligations that can't wait all day. Mr. Whitman continued reading without acknowledging her interruption. To my daughter Patricia Nakamura, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my personal jewelry collection, including my father's watch and my wife's engagement ring, with the hope that these family heirlooms will remind her of our shared heritage. The silence that followed was deafening. $50,000 was hardly insignificant, but in the context of an estate worth millions, it represented a token gesture rather than a substantial inheritance. Patricia's face had gone ashen, and Derek looked as if he'd been physically struck. That can't be right. Patricia whispered. There has to be more. The house, the vineyard, the business, where does all of that go? Mr. Whitman's expression remained professionally neutral, but I detected the slightest hint of satisfaction in his voice as he continued reading. To my beloved granddaughter, Zara Nakamura, who has shown true understanding of our family's values and commitment to preserving our legacy, I leave the entirety of my remaining estate. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly airless room. Derek made a choking sound, while Patricia stared at the attorney as if he'd just announced that gravity had been repealed. The remaining estate includes Mr. Whitman continued, the Nakamura family vineyard, and all associated properties, the family residence, all business assets and equipment, all financial accounts and investments, and all intellectual property related to the Nakamura Vineyards brand. I felt as if I was experiencing the scene from outside my own body. The inheritance was far beyond anything I'd imagined possible. My grandfather hadn't just remembered me in his will, he'd entrusted me with everything he'd spent his life building. Patricia found her voice first, though it came out as a harsh rasp. This is impossible. Dad would never cut me out of his inheritance. I'm his daughter, his only child. There has to be some mistake. There's no mistake, Mr. Whitman said gently. Vincent was very clear about his reasoning, which he detailed in a letter that accompanies the will. He withdrew a sealed envelope from the folder, my name written across the front in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. The sight of those familiar pen strokes, formed by hands that would never write again, brought tears to my eyes for the first time since receiving news of his death. However, Mr. Whitman continued, there is one additional element that needs to be addressed before we conclude today's proceedings. He reached for another document, this one bearing official seals and stamps that suggested government involvement. The codicil I mentioned earlier includes specific provisions regarding recent attempts to defraud the estate or manipulate Vincent's final wishes. Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. I think we should consult our own attorney before proceeding further. This entire situation seems highly irregular. You're certainly entitled to legal representation, Mr. Whitman agreed. However, the codicil contains information that directly affects both of you, and I'm legally obligated to present it as part of the formal will reading. Patricia remained seated, but her hands were clenched into fists on the table's surface. What kind of information? Mr. Whitman opened the codicil and adjusted his glasses. Vincent became aware, during his final months, that certain individuals were attempting to manipulate him into modifying his estate plans in ways that contradicted his genuine wishes. He looked directly at Patricia and Derek. He documented several instances of coercion, including attempts to isolate him from other family members, pressure to sign documents without proper legal review, and misrepresentations about Zara's involvement in the vineyard operations. The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Derek's face had gone from pale to gray, while Patricia looked as if she might be physically ill. That's completely false, Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. We were trying to help him organize his affairs. If he misunderstood our intentions, that's tragic, but it doesn't mean we did anything wrong. Mr. Whitman consulted the codicil again. Vincent was quite specific about the nature of these attempts. He mentioned pressure to transfer property rights immediately, rather than through normal inheritance procedures, suggestions that Zara was too busy with her own career to care about the family business, and recommendations that he simplify his estate plans to avoid complications. Each accusation hit like a physical blow, and I could see Derek and Patricia recognizing their own words and actions in my grandfather's documentation. Whatever they'd thought they were doing subtly, he'd been aware of and had been systematically recording for potential legal action. Furthermore, Mr. Whitman continued, Vincent discovered that certain individuals had gained unauthorized access to his private financial information, and were using that information to make claims about his mental competency and decision-making ability. Derek finally sat back down, his earlier bravado completely deflated. We never questioned his mental competency. We were concerned about his health, but we never suggested he wasn't capable of making his own decisions. According to the documentation Vincent provided me, Mr. Whitman said, conversations were recorded, in which his mental state was characterized as declining, and his attachment to the vineyard described as sentimental rather than practical. The precision of the quotes suggested that my grandfather had either taken detailed notes about specific conversations, or had actually recorded them. Either way, he'd clearly been far more aware of what was happening around him than Patricia and Derek had realized. Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. This is insane. Dad was paranoid and confused during his last months. Whatever he thought he heard or saw, it wasn't reality. We were trying to protect him from making mistakes that would hurt the family. That may have been your intention, Mr. Whitman replied diplomatically. However, Vincent's perception of your actions led him to take specific steps to protect his estate from what he viewed as potential fraud. He reached for yet another document, this one bearing the letterhead of a private investigation firm. Vincent hired professional investigators to document attempts to manipulate his estate plans. Their report includes photographs, recorded conversations, and detailed timelines of suspicious activities. The blood drained from Derek's face so completely that I worried he might faint. Recorded conversations. That's illegal without consent. Oregon is a one-party consent state, Mr. Whitman explained. Vincent was legally entitled to record any conversation he participated in, regardless of whether other parties were aware of the recording. He opened the investigator's report and removed a small digital recording device. Vincent specifically requested that portions of these recordings be played during the will reading, to ensure that all parties understood the context of his final decisions. Patricia and Derek exchanged a look of pure panic. Whatever they'd said during their private conversations with my grandfather, they clearly weren't confident that their words would reflect well on their character or intentions. I don't think that's necessary, Patricia said quickly. We understand Dad's position, and we respect his right to distribute his estate however he chose. There's no need to relitigate private family conversations. Mr. Whitman paused, his finger hovering over the device's play button. Vincent was very specific about his desire for complete transparency regarding the circumstances that led to his final estate decisions. However, if all parties prefer to waive the recording review, I can proceed directly to the final provisions. The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Patricia and Derek clearly wanted to avoid having their recorded words played back in this formal setting, but agreeing to waive the review might look like an admission of guilt.
Derek spoke first. We have nothing to hide, but this seems unnecessarily dramatic. If Vincent made his decisions based on misunderstandings, playing recordings won't change anything now.
Very well, Mr. Whitman said, setting the device aside. The final provision of the codicil states that in the event any party attempts to contest the will or challenge its provisions through legal action, additional evidence of fraud attempts will be released to appropriate authorities for potential criminal prosecution. The threat was clear and devastating. My grandfather hadn't just protected his estate from manipulation, he'd created a legal trap that would ensnare anyone who tried to overturn his decisions posthumously. Patricia stood slowly, her elegant appearance now disheveled and her face flushed with anger and humiliation. This isn't over. There are laws about elder abuse and mental manipulation. If Dad was so paranoid that he hired investigators to spy on his own family, that suggests mental incompetency, not clarity of thought. Mr. Whitman's response was swift and definitive. Vincent underwent comprehensive mental competency evaluations during his final months, administered by court-approved medical professionals. The results unequivocally confirm his mental clarity and legal capacity to make estate decisions. He withdrew yet another document from his seemingly endless folder. These evaluations were conducted independently, without family involvement, specifically to prevent any future challenges to his mental state during the period when he modified his will. The thoroughness of my grandfather's preparation was staggering. He'd anticipated every possible angle that someone might use to challenge his decisions and had systematically eliminated each potential avenue of attack. Rather than being the confused, manipulable elderly man that Patricia and Derek had apparently believed they were dealing with, he'd been executing a complex legal strategy to protect his legacy. Derek had gone completely silent, staring at the table as if he could make the entire situation disappear through concentration. Patricia continued standing, but her defiance was clearly wavering in the face of the overwhelming evidence of my grandfather's thorough preparation. There's one final element to address, Mr. Whitman said, reaching for the last document in his folder. Vincent's letter to Zara, which explains his reasoning and provides guidance for managing the inherited estate. He handed me the sealed envelope, my grandfather's handwriting blurring slightly as tears filled my eyes. Whatever his letter contained, it represented his final words to me, his last opportunity to share his thoughts and wishes for the future. I'll leave you to read that privately, Mr. Whitman said kindly. But I should mention that Vincent also provided specific instructions regarding the transition of vineyard operations and his hopes for maintaining family relationships despite the circumstances. Patricia laughed bitterly. Family relationships, he just destroyed any possibility of family unity with this vindictive will. $50,000 after a lifetime of being his daughter. It's insulting. Vincent's perspective, Mr. Whitman said carefully, was that true family relationships are based on love and respect rather than financial expectations. He hoped that time would allow everyone to understand his reasoning and find ways to move forward constructively. The idealism of that hope seemed tragically naive given the poisonous atmosphere now filling the conference room. Patricia and Derek had clearly been counting on inheriting substantial wealth, and discovering that their months of manipulation had not only failed but had been systematically documented was devastating to whatever future plans they'd made. As the formal will reading concluded and the initial shock began to wear off, I realized that my grandfather's final gift hadn't just been the vineyard and the financial security that came with it. He'd also given me the truth about Patricia and Derek's intentions, protecting me from potential future manipulation by revealing their true character. The inheritance was life-changing, but the knowledge was perhaps even more valuable. I now understood exactly who I could trust and who I needed to protect myself from as I moved forward with the enormous responsibility of managing the family legacy my grandfather had entrusted to my care. The silence in the conference room stretched endlessly after Mr. Whitman's final words. Patricia remained standing, her hands trembling slightly as she processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. Derek sat motionless, staring at the mahogany table as if it held answers to questions he couldn't formulate. I clutched my grandfather's letter, feeling the weight of his final words through the sealed envelope. Mr. Whitman began gathering the scattered documents with practiced efficiency, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The legal proceedings were complete, but the emotional aftermath was just beginning. I could feel Patricia's eyes burning into me, though when I glanced up her expression was unreadable, a mixture of rage, disbelief, and something that might have been calculation. "This changes everything," Derek finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. He looked up at Patricia with an expression that contained equal parts desperation and accusation. "We need to figure out our options. There has to be something we can do." Patricia's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Options? Did you hear what he just said? Dad documented everything. He hired investigators. He had mental competency evaluations. He built a legal fortress around his precious decision." She turned toward me, and for the first time since I'd known her, I saw my mother without any pretense or social facade. The carefully maintained appearance of concerned family member had evaporated, replaced by raw anger and barely contained hostility. "You knew, didn't you?" she accused. "All those visits, all that time spent playing the devoted granddaughter. You were manipulating him just as much as you claim we were." The accusation stung because it struck at my deepest insecurities about the inheritance. Had I somehow influenced my grandfather's decision through my involvement with the vineyard? Had my genuine interest in preserving the family legacy been perceived as calculating behavior designed to secure financial benefits? Mr. Whitman intervened before I could respond. "I can assure you that Zara had no knowledge of Vincent's estate plans. He was very specific about keeping his decisions confidential until after his death. Her inheritance came as a complete surprise to her, just as your bequest came as a surprise to you." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Convenient. The devoted granddaughter inherits millions, while the actual daughter gets pocket change. Forgive me if I find that difficult to believe." Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh screech. "We're not accepting this. There are legal avenues for challenging wills, especially when there's evidence of undue influence or mental manipulation." Mr. Whitman's expression remained calm, but his voice carried a warning edge. "I strongly advise against that course of action." Vincent anticipated potential challenges and prepared accordingly. Any contest attempt would trigger the release of additional evidence that would be uncomfortable for all parties involved. He gestured toward the recording device still sitting on the table. "What you heard today represents only a fraction of the documentation Vincent compiled. The investigator's complete report includes months of surveillance, financial transaction analysis, and detailed recordings of conversations where estate manipulation was explicitly discussed." Derek's face flushed red. "That's blackmail. You can't threaten people with criminal prosecution to prevent them from exercising their legal rights."
I'm not threatening anyone, Mr. Whitman replied evenly. I'm simply explaining the consequences that Vincent built into his estate plan. He was very concerned about protecting his final wishes from exactly the kind of challenge you're contemplating. Patricia moved closer to the table, leaning forward with the intensity of someone making a final desperate argument. Let me read that letter. If Dad really thought I was trying to manipulate him, maybe there's something in his final words that explains his reasoning. Maybe we can understand what went wrong. I instinctively pulled the envelope closer to my chest. This is private. It's addressed to me specifically. I'm his daughter, Patricia snapped. I have a right to know what lies he believed about me. I have a right to defend myself against whatever poison you fed him during all those cozy conversations. The accusation revealed more about Patricia's mindset than she probably intended. She wasn't asking to read the letter out of grief or desire for closure. She wanted to assess the evidence against her and potentially find ways to counter my grandfather's reasoning. Mr. Whitman stood, signaling that the formal proceedings had concluded. Vincent's letter is Zara's private inheritance, just like the vineyard and financial assets. Patricia, your inheritance consists of the monetary bequest and jewelry collection I mentioned. Derek, as you're not a family member, you have no legal standing in this estate matter. The dismissal was polite but absolute. Derek had been involved in the manipulation attempts, but he had no legitimate claim to any portion of the inheritance. His months of effort had resulted in exactly nothing, except potentially criminal exposure if Patricia decided to pursue legal challenges. Derek's face went through several color changes, before settling on an unhealthy gray. This is insane. We spent months helping Vincent with his affairs. We rearranged our lives to take care of him. We deserve some recognition for our sacrifices. Vincent's perspective, Mr. Whitman said, was that genuine care and affection shouldn't require financial compensation. He valued authentic relationships over transactional ones. The distinction cut to the heart of everything that had gone wrong between my grandfather and Patricia. She had approached their relationship during his final months as a business negotiation, rather than a family connection, and he had responded accordingly. I watched Derek processing the implications of the estate settlement for his personal situation. Whatever plans he'd made based on anticipated inheritance were now completely derailed. His relationship with Patricia had been largely built around their shared expectation of substantial wealth, and that foundation had just been destroyed. Patricia seemed to reach the same conclusion about Derek's likely reaction. She looked at him with growing wariness, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "What are you going to do now?" she asked quietly. Derek's response was immediate and revealing. "I need to protect myself. If there are criminal allegations being made, I need legal representation. I need to distance myself from decisions I wasn't fully informed about." The statement hung in the air like a betrayal. Derek was preparing to abandon Patricia, now that their scheme had failed, potentially even implicating her as the primary manipulator to protect himself from legal consequences. Patricia's expression shifted from wariness to contempt. "Protect yourself, we were partners in this. You encouraged every step we took. You were the one who suggested Dad was mentally declining. You were the one who said we needed to act quickly before he made mistakes. I was providing advice based on the information you gave me." Derek replied defensively. "You told me your father was confused and needed guidance. I was trying to help a family situation, not participate in some elaborate fraud scheme." The rapid deterioration of their alliance was fascinating and disturbing to witness. Months of careful planning and coordination were dissolving into mutual accusations and blame shifting within minutes of discovering their failure. Mr. Whitman cleared his throat diplomatically. "Perhaps it would be best if everyone took time to process today's information before making any hasty decisions. The estate settlement will require several weeks to complete, during which time all parties can consider their options carefully." He handed me a business card and a thick folder. "Zara, these documents contain information you'll need for managing the vineyard transition. I've also included contact information for the accountants, insurance agents, and other professionals who handle various aspects of the business operations." The folder felt heavy in my hands, representing not just paperwork but the enormous responsibility I'd just inherited. I owned a multimillion-dollar business with dozens of employees, and complex seasonal operations that I only partially understood from my photography work and casual involvement. "Maria Gonzalez has agreed to continue as vineyard manager," Mr. Whitman continued.
Vincent spoke with her extensively about succession planning and felt confident that the transition would be smooth with her guidance. The mention of Maria brought the first genuine relief I'd felt since entering the conference room. Her knowledge and experience would be invaluable as I learned to navigate the business aspects of vineyard ownership. More importantly, her loyalty to my grandfather's vision would help ensure that his legacy was preserved rather than corrupted. Patricia gathered her purse with sharp, angry movements. Don't think this is over. There are ways to challenge undue influence that don't require proving mental incompetency. If Dad was manipulated by someone who gained his trust through deception, that's grounds for overturning his decisions. Her threat was clearly directed at me, suggesting that she planned to argue I had somehow manipulated my grandfather into disinheriting her. The irony of the accusation, given the evidence of her own manipulation attempts, seemed lost on her entirely. Derek was already moving toward the door, clearly eager to escape the increasingly toxic atmosphere. Patricia, I think we should discuss our situation privately before making any public statements about legal challenges. His careful phrasing suggested he was already planning his exit strategy from their relationship. Whatever romantic or financial partnership they'd shared was unlikely to survive the complete failure of their inheritance scheme. I remained seated as they prepared to leave, still clutching my grandfather's letter and trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the span of an hour, my entire life had been transformed. I was now responsible for preserving a family legacy that represented 3 generations of work and dedication. As Patricia and Derek reached the conference room door, she turned back for one final confrontation. You may have won today, but inheriting something and successfully managing it are 2 completely different challenges. Dad's precious vineyard will be bankrupt within a year under your management. Her prediction carried the weight of genuine spite, but it also revealed her fundamental misunderstanding of my relationship with the business. She saw the vineyard as a financial asset to be managed or sold, while I understood it as a living legacy that required passionate stewardship rather than detached administration. We'll see, I replied quietly, refusing to engage with her anger or respond to her provocation. After they left, the conference room felt almost cathedral-like in its sudden silence. Mr. Whitman finished organizing his documents while I sat processing the emotional whiplash of the past hour. Grief over my grandfather's death, mixed with shock over the inheritance, anxiety about my new responsibilities, and anger over Patricia and Derek's manipulation attempts. How long did you know about their scheme? I asked Mr.
Whitman. He considered the question carefully before responding. Vincent first expressed concerns about 3 months ago. Initially, I thought he might be overreacting to normal family involvement in estate planning. However, as he provided more detailed information about specific conversations and incidents, it became clear that his concerns were legitimate. He sat back down across from me. Your grandfather was an exceptionally intelligent man who understood people's motivations very clearly. He recognized that Patricia's sudden interest in his affairs wasn't driven by filial affection but by financial expectations. The assessment was harsh but probably accurate. Patricia had shown little interest in the vineyard or my grandfather's well-being until Derek entered her life and they began calculating potential inheritance values. What happens now? I asked, gesturing toward the folder of business documents. Vincent left very detailed instructions for the transition process, Mr. Whitman explained. He wanted to ensure that you wouldn't be overwhelmed by the business aspects while you were grieving his loss. Maria has been briefed on the succession plan and is prepared to handle day-to-day operations while you learn the broader management responsibilities. He pulled out a separate envelope marked with my name in my grandfather's handwriting. He also left specific guidance about handling potential family conflicts and legal challenges. He was very concerned about protecting you from the kind of manipulation attempts he'd experienced. The thoughtfulness of my grandfather's preparation brought tears to my eyes. Even while dealing with Patricia and Derek's pressure, he'd been thinking about my emotional well-being and practical needs during the transition period. There's one more thing, Mr. Whitman said gently. Vincent asked me to tell you that he considered you the daughter he never had and that entrusting you with the family legacy was the easiest decision he'd ever made. The words broke through my emotional control completely. I'd spent years wondering whether my involvement with the vineyard was genuinely valued or merely tolerated as the well-intentioned meddling of a devoted granddaughter. Learning that my grandfather had viewed our relationship as equivalent to a parent-child bond was overwhelming in the best possible way. After collecting myself, I asked about the practical timeline for assuming control of the vineyard operations. Mr.
Whitman explained that the legal transfer would require several weeks but that I could begin learning the business immediately under Maria's guidance. Vincent also established a substantial operating account specifically for your first year of ownership, he added. He wanted to ensure that you wouldn't feel pressured to make hasty decisions about property sales or major operational changes while you were still learning the business. The foresight was typical of my grandfather's careful nature, but it also suggested that he'd been planning this transition for longer than just the final 6 months when he'd updated his will. He'd been thinking strategically about succession planning and had chosen me as his heir based on demonstrated commitment rather than genetic relationship. As I prepared to leave the law office, Mr. Whitman offered one final piece of advice. Your grandfather believed that the vineyard's success depended on maintaining its character and values rather than simply maximizing profits. He hoped you would preserve that philosophy while also bringing your own vision to the business. The guidance felt like a benediction and a challenge. I had inherited not just property and financial assets but also the responsibility to honor 3 generations of family dedication while adapting the business for future success. Walking through downtown Portland toward my car, I realized that Patricia's parting threat about my management capabilities might actually prove accurate if I approached the inheritance passively. Successfully running a complex agricultural business would require intensive learning, careful decision-making, and the ability to build trust with employees, customers, and industry partners who had known my grandfather for decades. However, I also possessed advantages that Patricia had overlooked in her spite. My photography business had given me extensive experience with wine industry marketing and operations. My years of involvement with the vineyard had provided practical knowledge about seasonal cycles, quality control, and customer preferences. Most importantly, I understood and shared my grandfather's vision for preserving the vineyard's character while building its reputation. The inheritance had given me the opportunity to honor my grandfather's legacy, but success would depend on my ability to transform that opportunity into effective leadership. As I drove toward the vineyard to begin the next phase of my life, I carried both the weight of enormous responsibility and the confidence that comes from being chosen for the right reasons by someone who understood both the challenge and my capacity to meet it. The sealed letter from my grandfather remained unopened in my purse, waiting for a private moment when I could absorb his final words without distraction. Whatever guidance and encouragement it contained would soon help me navigate the complex transition from granddaughter to owner, from observer to leader, from inheritor to steward of a legacy that now belonged entirely to me. The drive to the vineyard took 45 minutes through winding roads that cut through Oregon's rolling hills, but today the familiar journey felt like traveling to an entirely different destination. Every curve and landmark carried new significance now that I was returning not as a visiting granddaughter but as the owner of everything I could see. The weight of responsibility settled heavier with each mile, accompanied by a growing awareness that my life had fundamentally changed in ways I was only beginning to understand. As I pulled into the gravel driveway, I noticed Patricia's silver Mercedes already parked near the main house. My stomach clenched as I realized she and Derek had driven directly from the law office to the vineyard, probably to collect their belongings but possibly to cause additional problems during what was already an emotionally overwhelming day. Maria emerged from the vineyard office before I'd even turned off my engine. Her expression was cautious but warm, and she approached my car with the careful demeanor of someone who wasn't entirely sure how to navigate our suddenly altered relationship. For 15 years she'd been my grandfather's employee and my friendly acquaintance. Now technically I was her employer, though I felt completely unqualified for that responsibility. "Zara," she said as I stepped out of the car, "I heard about the will reading. How are you holding up?" Her concern was genuine, and I felt a rush of gratitude for her presence during what felt like the most disorienting day of my life. "Honestly, I'm not sure yet. Everything feels surreal." Maria nodded with understanding. "Your grandfather prepared me for this transition. He was very thorough about documenting his wishes and expectations for the vineyard's future. Whenever you're ready, we can go over everything together." The mention of preparation reminded me of the thick folder Mr. Whitman had given me, still sitting untouched in my car. My grandfather's systematic approach to planning extended far beyond legal documents into practical business operations, and I was beginning to appreciate the scope of forethought he'd invested in ensuring a smooth transition. "Patricia and Derek are inside," Maria continued, her tone carefully neutral. "They arrived about 20 minutes ago. I wasn't sure about their access rights under the new circumstances, so I've been keeping an eye on the situation." Her diplomatic phrasing told me everything I needed to know about the atmosphere in the house. Maria was too professional to speak negatively about family members, but her concern about keeping an eye on the situation suggested that Patricia and Derek's behavior was raising red flags. As we walked toward the house, I could hear raised voices coming from inside. The conversation was muffled by distance and closed windows, but the tone was clearly argumentative. Whatever Patricia and Derek were discussing, they weren't having a calm, rational conversation about next steps. Have they been arguing the entire time? I asked Maria. She nodded grimly. It started the moment they arrived. Derek went straight to the office and began going through desk drawers, looking for something specific. When Patricia questioned what he was doing, things escalated quickly. The image of Derek searching through my grandfather's personal belongings made my blood boil. Whatever he was looking for, he had no right to be rifling through private papers and documents that now belonged to me. The invasion felt particularly egregious given that they'd just learned about the extensive documentation of their manipulation attempts. I should probably go inside and address this, I said, though I dreaded the confrontation that was sure to follow. Maria touched my arm gently. Before you do, there's something you should know. Derek asked me specifically about property surveys and development assessments. He wanted to know if your grandfather had any recent appraisals done for subdivision potential. The revelation confirmed my worst suspicions about Derek's ultimate intentions for the vineyard. He hadn't been interested in preserving the family business or honoring my grandfather's legacy. He'd been calculating real estate values and development opportunities. The vineyard's 200 acres of prime Willamette Valley land would indeed be worth substantially more if subdivided for residential or commercial development than if maintained as agricultural property. What did you tell him? I asked. That I handle vineyard operations, not real estate matters, and that he'd need to speak with the estate attorney about any property documentation, Maria replied. He didn't seem satisfied with that answer. As we reached the front porch, the voices inside became clearer. Patricia was speaking in the sharp, controlled tone she used when she was furious but trying to maintain composure. This is exactly what I warned you about from the beginning. You pushed too hard, too fast. If you'd listened to me about taking a more gradual approach, we wouldn't be in this situation. Derek's response was defensive and increasingly desperate. Don't blame me for your father's paranoia. How was I supposed to know he was recording our conversations and hiring investigators? Normal people don't treat their own families like criminal suspects. Normal families don't plot to manipulate elderly relatives out of their inheritance. Patricia shot back. And normal boyfriends don't convince their girlfriends to betray their own fathers for money. The conversation revealed the complete breakdown of their partnership and their willingness to sacrifice each other to avoid responsibility for their failed scheme. I hesitated at the front door, uncertain whether to interrupt or allow them to continue destroying their relationship without my involvement. Maria made the decision for me by knocking firmly on the door frame. Excuse me, but Zara's here, and I think we need to address the current situation. The voices inside stopped abruptly, followed by the sound of hurried movement and whispered conversation. When Patricia opened the door, her face was flushed and her previously perfect appearance was disheveled from stress and anger. Zara, she said, attempting to restore her composed facade. We were just collecting our personal belongings and discussing our next steps. Behind her, Derek was hastily closing file folders and moving away from my grandfather's desk. Whatever he'd been searching for, he clearly hadn't found it, and my arrival had interrupted his investigation. I stepped into the house that was now legally mine, feeling strange about entering what had always been my grandfather's domain. The familiar rooms looked exactly the same, but my relationship to the space had been fundamentally altered. Every piece of furniture, every family photograph, every carefully chosen decoration now belonged to me, along with the responsibility to preserve or change them according to my own vision. What exactly are you looking for? I asked Derek directly, gesturing toward the scattered papers on the desk. He straightened defensively, just trying to understand the full scope of the estate. There might be documents that affect Patricia's inheritance rights or clarify some of the confusion from today's meeting. The explanation was obviously false. Mr. Whitman had been quite clear that all relevant estate documents were in his possession, and Derek had no legitimate reason to be searching through private papers. More likely, he was looking for information that might give him leverage for challenging the will or for his own financial planning. All estate documents are with the attorney, I said firmly. There's nothing here that would change the inheritance distribution we heard about today. Patricia moved closer to Derek, and I could see her evaluating the dynamics of our conversation. She was clearly trying to decide whether to support Derek's search or distance herself from his increasingly questionable behavior. Derek's just being thorough, she said finally. We want to make sure we understand all the implications of Dad's decisions before we make any commitments about our response. The word response carried ominous implications. They were still considering legal challenges or other actions to contest the will, despite Mr. Whitman's clear warnings about the consequences of such attempts. Maria had followed me into the house and was observing the interaction with the alertness of someone who understood the potential for conflict. Her presence was reassuring, providing a witness to whatever Patricia and Derek might say or do during this confrontation. "I think it would be best if you collected whatever personal belongings you have here and made arrangements to retrieve them soon," I said, trying to keep my tone reasonable but firm. "The estate transition needs to proceed, and I'll be working with Maria to understand the business operations." Derek's face darkened. "You're throwing us out. After everything we did to help Vincent during his final months." The accusation was particularly galling given what we'd learned about their true activities during those months. They hadn't been helping my grandfather, they'd been systematically manipulating him while he documented their behavior for potential legal action. "I'm not throwing anyone out," I replied. "I'm simply clarifying that this property now belongs to me, and I need to begin the transition process. You're welcome to visit as family, but the days of treating this place as your second home are over." Patricia's composure finally cracked completely. "Family? You want to talk about family? I'm his daughter, his only child, and you've somehow convinced him to cut me out of my own inheritance. Don't lecture me about family relationships when you've destroyed the only one that mattered." Her words stung because they touched on my own insecurities about the inheritance. Had I somehow manipulated my grandfather's affections without realizing it? Had my genuine interest in the vineyard been perceived as calculated behavior designed to secure financial benefits? But then I remembered Mr. Whitman's description of the extensive documentation my grandfather had compiled about Patricia and Derek's manipulation attempts. Their behavior had driven his decision to change his estate plans, not any actions on my part. "I didn't convince Grandpa Vincent of anything," I said quietly. "He made his own decisions based on his own observations about how different people treated him and what they valued about our family legacy." Derek stepped forward aggressively. "That's convenient. The innocent granddaughter who just happened to benefit from an old man's paranoia and confusion." Maria moved slightly closer to me, her body language protective. "Mr. Vincent was completely lucid and mentally sharp until the day he died," she said firmly. "I worked with him every day for 15 years, and there was never any question about his mental clarity or decision-making ability." Her testimony carried significant weight because of her long relationship with my grandfather and her professional qualifications as vineyard manager. Derek's attempts to characterize my grandfather as confused or paranoid fell apart when confronted with Maria's first-hand observations. Patricia seemed to recognize that their position was becoming increasingly untenable. "Fine, we'll collect our things and leave, but don't think this is over. There are legal options for challenging wills that were influenced by undue pressure, even if that pressure came from someone the deceased trusted." The threat was clear, but it also revealed the weakness of their position. After months of systematic manipulation that had been thoroughly documented, they were reduced to making vague accusations about my supposed influence over my grandfather's decisions. "You're certainly entitled to pursue whatever legal options you think are appropriate," I replied. Whitman explained that all such challenges would trigger additional evidence disclosure, so you'll want to consider that factor in your decision-making. Derek's face went pale as he remembered the attorney's warnings about the consequences of contesting the will. Whatever additional evidence my grandfather had compiled, Derek clearly wasn't confident that it would reflect well on his character or intentions. Over the next hour, Patricia and Derek gathered their personal belongings with tense efficiency. Derek collected clothes and toiletries from the guest room where he'd apparently been staying regularly, while Patricia retrieved jewelry and personal items she'd stored at the house over the years. I watched them work with conflicted emotions. Despite everything that had happened, Patricia was still my mother, and seeing her reduced to angrily stuffing belongings into suitcases was painful. Our relationship had never been close, but I'd held on to hope that we might eventually find common ground as adults. Derek, meanwhile, continued searching through papers and documents until I finally told him directly to stop. His desperation to find something useful was becoming increasingly obvious and uncomfortable to witness. "There's nothing here that will change the situation," I said as he reluctantly closed the last filing cabinet.
"Whatever you're looking for, it's either already with the attorney or it doesn't exist." He looked at me with genuine hatred. "You have no idea what you've cost us. The plans we made, the investments we counted on, the future we were building together." The admission was revealing. Derek's anger wasn't really about the injustice of the inheritance distribution, it was about the personal financial consequences of losing access to wealth he'd been counting on for his own plans. Patricia overheard his comment and turned on him with fury. "Our future? You mean your future? This was never about us as a couple. This was about you getting access to money you never earned." Their relationship was disintegrating in real time, each accusation revealing more about their true motivations and the transactional nature of their partnership. Whatever romantic connection had originally brought them together
had been corrupted by greed and mutual manipulation. As they prepared to leave, Derek made one final attempt to extract useful information. "What are your plans for the vineyard? Are you going to try to run it yourself, or will you be looking for buyers?" The question was clearly motivated by his continued interest in potential development opportunities. Even after losing any legitimate claim to the property, he was still calculating ways to profit from its eventual sale or development. "I plan to continue operating it as a vineyard," I said firmly. Preserving the family legacy was the most important factor in Grandpa Vincent's estate planning, and I intend to honor that priority. Derek's disappointment was visible, confirming that he'd been hoping I would be overwhelmed by the responsibility and choose to sell the property quickly. His development dreams were finally dying as he realized that I had both the motivation and support necessary to maintain the vineyard's agricultural character. After they left, the house felt simultaneously empty and liberated. The toxic energy of their presence had been replaced by a sense of possibility and peace that I hadn't experienced there in months. Maria and I spent the remainder of the afternoon reviewing the vineyard's current operations and my grandfather's detailed notes about succession planning. His preparation was even more thorough than I'd imagined, covering everything from seasonal workflow management to long-term business development strategies. "He spent months preparing these materials for you," Maria explained as we went through folder after folder of documentation. "He wanted to make sure you'd have everything you needed to make informed decisions about the vineyard's future." The love and care evident in his preparation brought tears to my eyes. While Patricia and Derek had been scheming to manipulate him, he'd been quietly building a foundation for my success as his successor. As evening approached, I finally opened the sealed letter my grandfather had written specifically for me. His familiar handwriting filled several pages with guidance, encouragement, and explanations about his estate decisions. "My dear Zara," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then my plans have succeeded, and you've inherited the responsibility I always hoped you would accept. You are the only person who truly understood what this vineyard represents and why it's worth preserving." He went on to explain his reasons for disinheriting Patricia, detailing his disappointment with her attempts to manipulate him, and his recognition that she viewed the vineyard as a financial asset rather than a family legacy. "I don't blame her for her perspective," he wrote. "People value different things, and Patricia has always been more interested in financial security than agricultural traditions. But I couldn't entrust our family's legacy to someone who would see it only as a source of money." His words about me were overwhelmingly generous, describing my involvement with the vineyard as evidence of character and commitment that went far beyond family obligation. He wrote about his pride in my business success, my artistic talent, and my understanding of the values that had guided 3 generations of vineyard development. The letter concluded with specific guidance about managing both the business challenges and family conflicts that would inevitably arise from his estate decisions. "Remember that leadership isn't about being perfect," he wrote. "It's about caring enough to make difficult decisions and learning from the inevitable mistakes. You have the heart and intelligence to succeed, and you have my complete confidence." Reading his final words to me while sitting in the house that was now mine, surrounded by the vineyard that represented his life's work, I felt a profound sense of connection to something larger than myself. The inheritance wasn't just property and money, it was a trust that linked me to past generations and future possibilities. The day had begun with shocking revelations about betrayal and manipulation, but it was ending with clarity about my purpose and responsibilities. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I had the foundation of my grandfather's wisdom, Maria's expertise, and my own determination to honor the legacy that had been entrusted to my care. 3 weeks after the will reading, I stood in the vineyard at dawn, watching the morning mist rise from the valley floor as I'd done countless times with my grandfather. The familiar ritual now carried different weight. I wasn't just visiting the family business anymore, I was responsible for every decision that would shape its future. The transition from granddaughter to owner had been both smoother and more challenging than I'd anticipated, marked by small victories and unexpected complications that tested my resolve daily. The most immediate challenge had been managing the legal aftermath of Patricia's decision to contest the will despite Mr. Whitman's warnings. 2 days after our confrontation at the vineyard, she'd hired a Portland attorney specializing in estate disputes and filed formal papers challenging my grandfather's mental competency and alleging undue influence on my part. Her lawyer had crafted arguments suggesting that my involvement with the vineyard photography and marketing had constituted manipulation designed to secure inheritance benefits. Mr. Whitman had anticipated this exact scenario. Within hours of receiving Patricia's legal filing, he delivered a comprehensive response that included the investigator's complete report, medical competency evaluations, and extensive recordings of Patricia and Derek's manipulation attempts. The evidence was so overwhelming that Patricia's attorney had withdrawn from the case within a week, citing ethical concerns about pursuing frivolous litigation. The recordings were particularly devastating. Patricia's voice could be heard clearly discussing strategies for convincing my grandfather that I was too busy with my career to care about the vineyard, while Derek outlined plans for maximizing property values through potential development. Their conversations revealed calculated deception rather than genuine concern for my grandfather's well-being, completely undermining any claims about their good intentions. The legal challenge's swift collapse had broader consequences beyond just protecting the inheritance. Derek had indeed abandoned Patricia once criminal fraud allegations became a serious possibility, moving out of her apartment and blocking her phone calls to avoid any association with the failed scheme. His desertion left Patricia not only without the inheritance she'd expected, but also without the relationship she'd sacrificed family bonds to pursue. Meanwhile, the vineyard operations continued with remarkable smoothness under Maria's experienced guidance. She'd prepared detailed transition plans that allowed me to gradually assume management responsibilities without disrupting critical seasonal activities. The spring pruning had been completed on schedule, soil preparation for new plantings was proceeding normally, and our existing customer relationships remained strong despite the ownership change. Learning the business aspects of vineyard management proved both fascinating and overwhelming. Every decision connected to multiple other factors in ways I was still discovering. Choosing harvest timing affected wine quality, storage capacity, labor scheduling, and customer delivery commitments simultaneously. Marketing strategies had to balance brand prestige with volume sales while considering vintage variations and competitive pressures from other regional wineries. My photography background provided unexpected advantages in understanding the aesthetic and marketing aspects of wine production. I could visualize how different vineyard management decisions would affect the visual appeal of the property for promotional materials, and my existing relationships with food and beverage photographers created opportunities for enhanced marketing collaboration. More importantly, my years of casual involvement with harvest activities and customer events had given me genuine appreciation for the craftsmanship and seasonal rhythms that define successful vineyard operations. I understood why my grandfather had prioritized quality over quantity, and why maintaining the vineyard's reputation for excellence required patient, consistent effort rather than dramatic changes. The financial aspects of inheritance had also proven more complex than simply receiving valuable assets. The estate taxes alone required careful planning to avoid forcing property sales, and the ongoing operational expenses of running a sophisticated agricultural business were substantial. My grandfather had left detailed financial projections and emergency reserves, but I needed to develop my own understanding of cash flow management and investment priorities. 6 weeks after inheriting the vineyard, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I'd learned about managing both business operations and family relationships. Patricia's voice on the other end of the line sounded different, subdued and uncertain rather than angry and demanding. "Zara, I know we haven't spoken since the legal situation ended, but I was hoping we could meet and talk," she said quietly. "There are things I need to say, and I think we both need some kind of closure about what happened." Her request surprised me. After the viciousness of her will contest and the recordings that had revealed her true intentions, I'd assumed our relationship was permanently severed. The fact that she was reaching out suggested either genuine remorse or another calculated attempt to achieve some advantage I couldn't yet identify. "What exactly do you want to discuss?" I asked carefully. "Everything," she replied. "The mistakes I made, the choices that led to this situation, and whether there's any possibility of rebuilding some kind of relationship between us." The conversation was awkward and tentative, but I agreed to meet at a neutral location in Portland the following week. Whatever her motivations, I felt obligated to at least listen to what she had to say. Despite everything that had happened, she was still my mother, and completely cutting off that relationship would represent its own kind of loss. We met at a quiet coffee shop downtown, away from the vineyard and the law offices where our previous encounters had been so contentious. Patricia looked older than I remembered, with stress lines around her eyes and a general appearance of someone who'd been through a prolonged ordeal. "I want to start by apologizing," she began without preamble. "Not just for the legal challenge, but for everything that led up to Dad's death. I lost sight of what mattered, and I let greed and poor judgment destroy my relationships with the two most important people in my life. Her directness caught me off guard. I'd expected defensive explanations or attempts to justify her behavior, not immediate acceptance of responsibility. Derek's gone, she continued. He moved to California last week to pursue some real estate opportunity there. He made it clear that our relationship was entirely based on financial expectations that no longer exist. The admission was painful to hear, though not particularly surprising given Derek's behavior during the will reading and its aftermath. His abandonment had left Patricia not only financially disappointed, but also emotionally devastated by the recognition that she'd sacrificed family relationships for a partnership that had never been genuine. I've been seeing a therapist, Patricia said, trying to understand how I got to the point where I could treat my own father the way I did. I think losing Mom when I was so young affected me more than I realized, and I never learned to value emotional connections over financial security. Her psychological insights seemed genuine, though I remained cautious about accepting them at face value. People could be remarkably self-aware about their motivations while remaining unchanged in their actual behavior patterns. What do you want from me? I asked directly. Patricia stirred her coffee thoughtfully before responding. Honestly, I'd like to understand what you plan to do with the vineyard. Not because I have any claim to it, but because it represents Dad's life work, and I want to know that his legacy will be preserved. The question felt like a test of my commitment and competence, though her tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than skeptical challenge. I spent nearly an hour describing my plans for the vineyard's future, emphasizing my intention to maintain its agricultural character while gradually expanding its market presence through enhanced photography and marketing. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that demonstrated surprising knowledge about wine industry trends and challenges. You sound like you really understand what you've inherited, she said finally. Dad was right about your commitment to preserving what he built. Her acknowledgement meant more to me than I'd expected. Despite our conflicts, Patricia's opinion still mattered because of her connection to my grandfather and her perspective on family legacy issues. As our conversation continued, Patricia revealed additional details about her relationship with Derek and the gradual escalation of their manipulation attempts. She described how his initial suggestions about estate planning had evolved into increasingly aggressive schemes to accelerate inheritance distribution. He convinced me that Dad was getting too old to make good decisions about the vineyard's future, she explained. He said we needed to intervene before Dad made mistakes that would hurt the family financially. The rationalization revealed how Derek had exploited Patricia's existing anxieties about her father's aging and her own financial insecurity. His manipulation of her had been almost as calculating as their joint manipulation of my grandfather. I know this doesn't excuse my behavior, Patricia continued, but I want you to understand that I wasn't entirely acting on my own initiative. Derek was very persuasive about the necessity of protecting family interests. While I appreciated her explanation, I also recognized that she was still avoiding complete responsibility for her choices. Derek might have influenced her decisions, but she'd been an adult capable of independent judgment who'd chosen to participate in deceptive and manipulative behavior. What are you going to do now? I asked. Patricia's expression grew uncertain. I'm not sure. The inheritance I received covers my immediate expenses, but I need to find a new direction for my life. Losing Derek and Dad in the same month has forced me to confront how isolated I've become from meaningful relationships. Her situation was objectively difficult, though it was largely the result of her own choices. At 54, she faced the challenge of rebuilding both her financial situation and her social connections after burning bridges with family and discovering that her romantic relationship had been based on false premises. Are you asking for help? I said, not entirely sure what kind of assistance I could or should provide. No, she replied quickly. I need to figure this out on my own. But I was hoping we might be able to maintain some kind of relationship going forward. Not like before, obviously, but maybe something that acknowledges we're still family despite everything that's happened. Her request was reasonable but emotionally complicated. The recordings and legal challenges had revealed aspects of her character that I found difficult to forgive or forget. At the same time, completely severing our relationship would mean losing the only remaining connection to my mother's side of the family. I'm willing to try, I said cautiously, but it would need to be a very different relationship than what we had before. No discussion of vineyard business decisions, no financial expectations, and definitely no attempts to influence how I manage the inheritance. Patricia nodded readily. I understand completely. Whatever relationship we rebuild would need to be based on respect for the choices Dad made and your right to determine the vineyard's future. Our conversation ended with tentative agreement to meet occasionally for coffee or lunch, with the understanding that rebuilding trust would be a gradual process requiring consistent evidence of changed behavior on her part. As autumn arrived, the vineyard's first harvest under my ownership provided both a practical test of my management capabilities and an emotional connection to generations of family tradition. The process required coordinating dozens of seasonal workers, managing complex logistics for grape processing and storage, and making critical decisions about quality control that would affect wine production for years to come. Maria's guidance was invaluable throughout the harvest, but I gradually assumed more direct responsibility for overseeing operations and communicating with customers and industry partners. My photography skills proved useful for documenting the process and creating marketing materials that enhanced the vineyard's reputation for combining traditional techniques with modern quality standards. The harvest's financial results exceeded my grandfather's projections, validating both his business planning and my emerging management approach. More importantly, the process had strengthened my relationships with employees and customers, who were initially skeptical about the ownership transition, but gradually recognized my commitment to maintaining the vineyard's standards and character. 6 months after inheriting the vineyard, I reflected on the transformation that had occurred in both my personal and professional life. The shy granddaughter who'd once worried about her legitimate place in family business decisions had evolved into a confident owner capable of making complex strategic choices about agricultural operations, marketing initiatives, and employee management. The inheritance had provided not just financial security, but also a sense of purpose that connected my daily work to something larger than personal ambition. Every decision about vineyard management carried the weight of preserving 3 generations of family dedication, while adapting traditional practices for contemporary market conditions. Patricia and I had managed to establish a cautious but functional relationship based on mutual respect for appropriate boundaries. Our monthly coffee meetings remained somewhat formal and guarded, but they represented progress toward accepting our changed family dynamics without bitterness or ongoing conflict. She'd found work as a real estate agent, using her social skills and knowledge of the Portland area to build a modest but stable income. Her career choice seemed appropriate for someone who'd always been more interested in financial transactions than agricultural traditions, and she appeared to be finding satisfaction in work that matched her natural abilities and interests. The vineyard continued thriving under management that balanced preservation of my grandfather's vision with selective innovations that enhanced efficiency and market appeal. My photography background had led to collaborations with other regional wineries and restaurants, creating new revenue streams while building industry relationships that benefited all participating businesses. The legal challenges that had once seemed so threatening had ultimately strengthened my position by conclusively establishing both my legitimate inheritance rights and the documented evidence of Patricia and Derek's manipulation attempts. The attempted will contest had served as a cautionary example to other potential challengers, while demonstrating the thoroughness of my grandfather's estate planning. As the first anniversary of my grandfather's death approached, I planned a memorial celebration at the vineyard that would honor his legacy while marking the successful transition to new ownership. The event would include long-term employees, loyal customers, and industry partners who'd supported the vineyard's continued success, despite concerns about ownership changes. Patricia had asked if she could attend the memorial, acknowledging that her presence might be awkward, but expressing genuine desire to pay respects to her father's memory. After considerable deliberation, I'd agreed, recognizing that the memorial's purpose was honoring my grandfather's life, rather than relitigating family conflicts. The memorial celebration proved to be both emotionally moving and professionally significant, bringing together people whose relationships with my grandfather spanned decades of shared commitment to agricultural excellence and community involvement. Stories shared throughout the evening revealed aspects of his character and influence that I'd never fully understood, deepening my appreciation for the legacy I'd inherited. Patricia's attendance was indeed somewhat uncomfortable initially, but she conducted herself with appropriate dignity and restraint. Several longtime employees and customers made a point of speaking with her respectfully, acknowledging her connection to the family despite recent conflicts. By evening's end, her presence felt less intrusive and more like a natural part of honoring our shared family history. The memorial also served as an informal business celebration, as attendees congratulated me on successfully managing the ownership transition while maintaining the vineyard's reputation and operational standards. Industry partners expressed confidence in my leadership and enthusiasm for potential future collaborations, validating my approach to balancing tradition with innovation. As guests departed and I walked through the vineyard in the quiet aftermath of the memorial, I felt a profound sense of completion regarding the events that had begun with my grandfather's death nearly a year earlier. The inheritance that had initially seemed overwhelming had become a source of purpose and satisfaction that connected my daily work to something enduring and meaningful. The betrayal that had once seemed so devastating now appeared as a necessary revelation that had ultimately protected the family legacy from people who would have exploited it for personal gain. My grandfather's careful planning and documentation had not only secured the inheritance for someone who would preserve his values, but had also provided valuable lessons about recognizing and protecting against manipulation. Standing among the vines that represented 3 generations of family dedication, I understood that the true inheritance hadn't been the property or financial assets, but rather the responsibility to serve as steward for something larger than individual ambition. The vineyard would continue evolving under my ownership, adapting to changing market conditions and consumer preferences, while maintaining the commitment to quality and integrity that had defined its character from the beginning. The future stretched ahead with challenges and opportunities that I felt prepared to meet, supported by the foundation of my grandfather's wisdom, Maria's expertise, and my own growing confidence as both a business owner and a guardian of family tradition. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, I had the resources and relationships necessary to ensure that the Nakamura vineyard would continue flourishing for future generations, who might someday inherit their own responsibility for preserving what we'd built together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.